The man behind the counter did not look up. His name was Mr. Hemlock, and his attention was fixed on a ledger, his pen scratching a thin, dry sound into the quiet of the land office. I stood waiting, my hands clasped in front of me. The dust motes danced in the single beam of afternoon light slanting through the tall, dirty window. 2 other men were in the room, slumped in chairs against the far wall, their hats low over their eyes. They smelled of sweat and cheap tobacco. One of them coughed, a wet, rattling sound. I kept my eyes on the back of Mr. Hemlock's balding head. Finally, he closed the ledger with a soft thud. He looked at me over the top of his spectacles. "Yes?" he asked. His voice was flat, impatient. "I'm here about Parcel 7B, I said. My own voice sounded small in the high-ceilinged room. He blinked slowly. "7B?" "The Blackwood Mire." A corner of his mouth twitched. He pulled out a large, rolled map and spread it across the counter, weighing the corners down with inkwells. His finger, stained dark with ink, traced a line along the river before stopping at a blotchy, shaded area on the edge of the county. "That one," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "I'd like to purchase it." For the first time, he gave me his full attention. He leaned back, the chair groaning under his weight. He looked at my worn dress, my scuffed boots, the frayed edges of my shawl. He looked at my hands, clean but chapped from lye soap. His gaze was an appraisal, and it found me wanting. From the corner, one of the men snorted. The other chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. Mr. Hemlock began, with the tone a man uses to explain something simple to a child, "That parcel is unworkable. It's a swamp. Nothing but mud, cypress knees, and mosquitoes. The county's been trying to unload it for 10 years. The timber's no good, you can't graze it, and you surely can't farm it." "I'm aware," I said. "What is the price?" He sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of bureaucratic patience. He shuffled through a stack of papers, his lips moving as he read. $12, he said, then looked at me as if expecting a protest. I did not protest. I reached into the small cloth purse I carried and took out the coins. 1 gold eagle, worth $10, and 2 heavy silver dollars. I counted them out onto the scarwood of the counter. They made a small, definitive sound. The laughter from the corner stopped. The men were watching now, their curiosity piqued by the sight of actual money. Mr. Hemlock stared at the coins, then back at me. His skepticism curdled into simple confusion. "You're certain?" he asked. "I am." He shrugged, the decision made for him. He took my money and swept it into a drawer. He prepared the deed, his pen scratching again, filling in my name, Martha Thorne. He sanded the ink, blew the excess away, and stamped it with a heavy, thudding seal. He pushed the document across the counter. It was a single sheet of thick, creamy paper. I picked it up. My name, written in his precise, looping script, looked foreign and important. This paper said I owned something. It was the first thing I had ever owned by myself. I folded it carefully and tucked it into my dress. Thomas had left me with very little, but he had left me a small map, drawn on the back of an old receipt. On it, Parcel 7B was circled in faded pencil. A single X marked a spot near its center. I did not know what it meant. But it was the only mystery he had left behind, and for $12 I had just purchased the right to solve it. The walk to the edge of town and then beyond it was long. The sun was a flat white disk in a pale sky. The road dissolved from a packed, rutted track into a faint path overgrown with thistle and Queen Anne's lace. I carried a shovel over my shoulder and a small canvas sack with a jar of water and a piece of bread. The air grew thick and heavy, the dry dust of the plains giving way to a damp, loamy smell. The sounds changed, too. The chirping of sparrows was replaced by the drone of insects and the deep croak of frogs I could not see. I was on my property now. The deed in my pocket felt warm against my skin. It was exactly as Mr. Hemlock had described it. A miserable place. The ground beneath my feet softened, the grass becoming spongy and dark. Water stood in stagnant pools, slicked with a rainbow film of oil from decaying leaves. Cypress trees rose from the muck, their branches draped in grey, trailing moss that looked like old men's beards. The air was so humid it felt like I was breathing water. The mosquitoes were a constant, whining presence around my head. I could hear the men in the land office laughing again, a faint echo in my memory. They saw a useless swamp. Thomas must have seen something else. I had to trust that. I pulled out his map. The paper was soft and worn, folded and unfolded so many times the creases were threatening to tear. It was a crude drawing, but the landmarks were clear enough for someone who knew the area. A bend in the slow-moving creek, a cluster of 3 large boulders, and the primary feature, a great cypress, split down the middle by a lightning strike years ago. I walked for another 20 minutes, my boots sinking into the mud with each step, making a wet, sucking sound when I pulled them free. Then I saw it. The split cypress was unmistakable, a jagged silhouette against the sky, one half living and green, the other dead and skeletal. It stood on a small rise of ground, an island of slightly firmer earth in the mire. This was the place. The X on the map was at the base of the dead half of the trunk. I dropped my sack and leaned the shovel against the tree. I took a drink of water and ate my bread, my eyes scanning the ground. It looked no different from any other patch of mud. Dark, wet soil, a carpet of rotting leaves, a few pale, sickly-looking ferns. For a moment, a wave of profound doubt washed over me. I had spent nearly everything I had on a piece of useless land based on a cryptic pencil mark made by a man who was gone. A man I loved, but a man who had grown quiet and distant in his last year, lost in books I did not understand. But I had come this far. There was nothing to do but dig. I picked up the shovel. The handle was smooth and worn from Thomas's own hands. It felt like a promise. I pushed the blade into the soft earth. The work began. The mud was heavy and dense, more clay than soil. It clung to the shovel, and I had to scrape it off with my boot after each load. It was slow, grueling labor. An hour passed. My back ached, and sweat ran into my eyes, stinging them. The hole grew, a dark wound in the earth. I was digging a grave, perhaps for my own foolish hopes. My shovel struck something. It wasn't the dull thud of a root or the grating scrape of a rock. It was a hollow, wooden sound. My heart beat a little faster. I knelt down, ignoring the cold mud soaking through the knees of my dress, and began to dig with my hands. The object was about 2 feet down. I clawed at the packed earth, my fingers growing numb. Slowly, I cleared the mud away from a dark, rectangular shape. It was a box. The wood was soft and spongy with rot, the corners crumbling as I worked to free it. It was heavier than it looked. I finally managed to work my fingers underneath it and lever it out of the hole. It sat on the ground beside me, a block of mud-caked, decaying timber. The lid was not nailed down, but swollen shut. I used the edge of the shovel blade to pry it open. The wood splintered and moaned in protest. With a final, sucking pop, the lid came free. The smell that rose from the inside was of damp earth, oil, and time. It was not the smell of treasure. Inside, nestled in a bed of what looked like sawdust, was a bundle wrapped in dark, greasy oilcloth. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted it out. It was heavy. I carefully unwrapped the layers. The oilcloth had done its job. The contents were mostly dry. There were 2 things. The first was a small journal, its leather cover warped but intact. The second was a set of 6 small glass jars, corked and sealed with wax. 5 of them were empty. The 6th contained about an inch of fine, heavy, black sand. I uncorked it and poured a little into my palm. It was gritty and strangely dense, catching the light with a faint, metallic sheen but not a sparkle. It meant nothing to me. I set the jar aside and opened the journal. The pages were filled with Thomas's familiar, precise handwriting. But it was not a diary of his thoughts or feelings. It was something else entirely. The pages were dense with notes, calculations, and strange, intricate diagrams. I saw chemical symbols I didn't recognize and drawings of complicated contraptions made of troughs, screens, and barrels. I flipped through the pages, a growing sense of confusion mixing with my disappointment. There were no words of love, no explanation, no secret confession. Just page after page of what looked like scientific notation. I had not found a treasure. I had found my husband's homework. I sat back on my heels in the mud of the swamp, the open journal in my lap, and I felt utterly, completely alone. The mosquitoes whined. The sun began to dip below the cypress trees, casting long, distorted shadows across the water. I had spent my last dollars on a box of sand and a book I couldn't read. The cabin was dark except for the single oil lamp on the table, which cast a circle of warm, flickering light. For weeks, that circle of light was my entire world. I spent every evening with the journal. During the day, I did what I had to do, tending the small garden, mending my clothes, keeping the fire. But my mind was always on the book. At first, the pages were an impenetrable wall of symbols and strange words. Hydraulic classification, specific gravity, amalgamation. It was a language I did not speak. But Thomas had been a patient man, and his notes were methodical. He defined his terms. He drew pictures. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to understand. This was not the journal of a treasure hunter. It was the journal of a student. A scientist. He had been teaching himself geology, chemistry, and engineering from books he must have ordered from back east. There were references to other texts, authors I had never heard of. He was documenting a process. The diagrams were not of a single machine, but of a system. A way to take the very mud I had been digging in and force it to give up its secrets. He wrote about the geology of the region, about ancient riverbeds buried by millennia of sediment. He believed a prehistoric river had once cut through this valley, a river that carried gold down from the mountains. Over eons, the valley had become a swamp, and the gold, ground into a fine powder by the water and rocks, had settled into the deep layers of clay. It wasn't nuggets you could pick up. It was flour gold, as fine as dust, invisible to the naked eye when mixed with the soil. The black sand in the jar was the key. Thomas called it magnetite. He explained that because of its weight, it would separate from the lighter soil along with the gold. Finding the black sand was the first step. The journal detailed 2 methods for the next step. One was complex, involving mercury and nitric acid, things I could not get and would not know how to use. The other was simpler, older. It was a machine that used water and gravity. A sluice box, he called it, but the version in his diagram was more advanced, a rocker box. It was a long, tiered trough on a set of curved legs that would allow it to be rocked back and forth. The motion would agitate the slurry of mud and water, letting the heavy gold and black sand settle into riffles, small barriers, on the bottom, while the lighter mud and gravel washed away. I stared at the diagram for a long time. It was complicated, with precise angles and measurements. But it was just wood and nails. I had wood. The old shed behind the cabin had collapsed in a storm the winter before Thomas died. Its timber was old and weathered, but it was sound. I had nails, a small coffee can full of them that I had saved over the years, some bent, some rusted. I had Thomas's tools, a saw, a hammer, a plane. They were all I needed. The laughter of the men in the land office had faded. It was replaced by the quiet, steady scratching of Thomas's pen, a voice from the page telling me what to do next. He had not left me a treasure map. He had left me a blueprint. He had not given me the gold. He had given me the knowledge of how to find it. The thought settled in my chest, a small, warm weight. It was better than gold. It was a second chance. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of labor. In the mornings, I worked in the remnants of the collapsed shed, prying boards free, pulling out old nails one by one. I would place the bent nails on a flat stone and straighten them with careful taps of the hammer. Each reclaimed nail felt like a small victory. The wood was mostly pine, grayed by the sun and rain, but the core was solid. I used Thomas's hand plane to smooth the worst of the splintered surfaces, the blade whispering as it peeled away thin curls of wood that smelled of resin and dust. I followed the diagrams in the journal, which I kept open on a nearby tree stump, weighted down with a rock. I measured the boards twice with a piece of knotted string before I sawed, my arm aching with the repetitive motion. The sound of the saw was a steady, rasping breath in the quiet yard. I was not a carpenter, and my work was crude. The cuts were not perfectly straight, the joints not perfectly flush. But it began to take shape. A long, narrow trough, 3 feet long and a foot wide. I built smaller, removable frames with canvas stretched across them to act as screens for sorting the gravel. I built the riffles for the bottom of the trough, small slats of wood that would catch the heavy particles. The hardest part was the rockers, the curved pieces of wood that the whole contraption would sit on. I had to find a naturally curved branch and carefully saw it in half lengthwise. It took me an entire afternoon. My hands were raw, blistered, and dotted with splinters. At night, I would soak them in warm salt water, the sting a sharp reminder of the day's work. Mr. Gable, my closest neighbor whose farm was a mile down the road, rode by one afternoon on his wagon. He was a good man, but a practical one, with little time for things he did not understand. He stopped and watched me for a long time, his brow furrowed. I was fitting the legs onto the main box. "What is that you're building, Martha?" he asked, his voice laced with a gentle, pitying curiosity. "A wash box," I said, not looking up from my work. "For laundry?" he asked. "For soil," I replied. He was silent for a moment. I could feel his gaze on the strange, awkward-looking machine. "Folks in town said you bought the Blackwood parcel," he said. I hammered a nail into place. It went in crooked. I pulled it out and started again. "There's nothing out there but bad water and snakes," he added, his tone implying he was doing me a favor by pointing this out. "I know," I said. He sighed, a sound of resignation. "Well," he said, and clucked to his horse. The wagon creaked away. I did not watch him go. His doubt was no different from the laughter in the land office. It was a wall I had to ignore. Thomas had believed. That was enough. After a week of work, it was finished. It was ugly and unbalanced, but it matched the drawings. I had to take it apart to carry it, making several trips out to the swamp, to the slow-moving creek near the split cypress. I reassembled it on the bank, the rockers settling into the soft earth. I had my machine. I had the location. Now, all that was left was the work. I took the shovel and walked to the spot where I had found the box. The mud was waiting. The first few days were a lesson in failure. The rocker box was clumsy. Getting the right rhythm, a steady side-to-side motion, was difficult. Too slow and the mud just sat there. Too fast and the water sloshed out, taking the precious black sand with it. The creek was slow, and I had to haul water in a bucket to pour over the mud I shoveled into the top screen. Shovel, carry, pour, rock. Shovel, carry, pour, rock. The repetition was grueling, monotonous. My back and arms screamed in protest. The sun beat down, and the humidity was suffocating. Swarms of biting flies rose from the disturbed mud. At the end of each day, I would carefully remove the riffles from the bottom of the box and wash the collected material into a pan. It was mostly mud. A thick, dark slurry with a small amount of the heavy black sand settled at the bottom. I would pan this concentrate in the creek, using a circular motion to wash the lighter silt away. Each time, my heart would pound as the last of the mud swirled away, revealing the bottom of the pan. And each time, there was nothing. Just the dull, black magnetite. No yellow. No glint. No color at all. Doubt began to creep back in, a cold and unwelcome companion. Maybe Thomas had been wrong. Maybe his theories were just the hopeful scribblings of a dying man. Maybe the single jar of black sand in the box was all he had ever found, the product of a lucky scoop. I thought of the $12. I could have bought flour and beans to last me through the winter. I could have bought a new pair of boots. Instead, I had bought a swamp and a broken dream. I was tired. My body ached with a deep, weary pain. I sat on the bank of the creek, the empty pan in my lap, and watched a water snake glide silently through the murky water. I thought about giving up. I could just walk away, leave the strange wooden box to rot in the swamp. I could go back to my quiet life of mending and gardening, of just getting by. But then I thought of Thomas's hands, the ink stains on his fingers from his late-night studies. I thought of the quiet intensity in his eyes when he read. He had not been a dreamer. He was the most practical man I had ever known. He would not have wasted his final months on a fantasy. He must have been sure. His certainty, recorded in the pages of his journal, became my own. I would not give up. Not yet. I would work for one more week. I would follow his instructions to the letter. If there was nothing at the end of that week, then I would stop. The next day, I changed my location. The journal had a small, hand-drawn map of the immediate area around the split cypress. It showed how the ancient, buried river channel curved. I had been digging on the inside of the curve. His note suggested the heaviest deposits would settle on the outside of the curve, where the water would have slowed. I moved my operation about 50 feet to the north, to a spot that looked no different but was, according to the map, in the center of that old channel. The mud here was different. It was denser, with more clay, and flecked with small, rounded pebbles. It felt heavier on the shovel. I started the process again. Shovel, carry, pour, rock. The rhythm was more familiar now, my muscles more accustomed to the strain. The sun climbed, reached its peak, and began its slow descent, turning the stagnant water of the swamp to polished brass. It was late afternoon, the light growing long and orange, when I cleaned out the riffles for the final time that day. I was tired and hungry, my hope worn thin as an old sheet. I knelt by the creek with the pan of concentrate. I did not expect to see anything. I began to wash it, the water turning dark with silt. Swirl, tilt, wash. Swirl, tilt, wash. The black sand appeared, a dark crescent at the bottom of the pan. And then I saw it. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a stray sunbeam glinting on a grain of mica. But it did not vanish when I shifted the pan. It was a tiny, brilliant yellow fleck. Smaller than a pinhead. But it was there. My breath caught in my throat. I swirled the pan again, more gently this time. Another fleck appeared. And another. They were tiny, almost microscopic, but they were unmistakably gold. They clung to the bottom of the pan, a sparse, beautiful constellation in a sea of black sand. It was real. Thomas was right. It was real. I worked with a renewed and desperate energy. For 6 more weeks, I followed the sun's schedule, rising before dawn and working until the light failed. The process never changed. Shovel, carry, pour, rock. The pile of discarded mud and gravel grew into a small grey hill beside the creek. My body hardened, the blisters on my hands turning to thick calluses. I learned the language of the machine, the precise rhythm that yielded the most black sand. I learned to read the mud, to recognize the bluish clay layer that held the richest deposits. Each evening, I would pan the day's concentrate, and each evening, the tiny yellow specks would appear. They never came easily. It was a battle for every grain. Slowly, painstakingly, I filled one of the small glass jars from Thomas's box. I would add each day's collection of flour gold and black sand, tapping the jar to settle the contents. It took what felt like an eternity to fill it to the top. The jar was small enough to fit in the palm of my hand, but it was surprisingly heavy. It felt dense with labor and hope. The time had come to find out what it was worth. The nearest assayer was in Prairie Ridge, a town 2 stops down the railway line. The train ticket cost 25 cents, a significant expense. I packed the jar carefully into my bag, wrapped in a spare piece of cloth, along with a piece of bread and some cheese. I put on my best dress, the one I saved for church, though I had not been in months. I walked into town feeling conspicuous and nervous, the weight of the jar in my bag a heavy secret. The assayer's office was a narrow storefront squeezed between a saloon and a dry goods store. The sign above the door read, Finch and Son, Assayers. The window was thick with dust, and the paint on the door was peeling. I pushed it open, and a small bell jingled. The air inside was sharp with the smell of chemicals and hot metal. The front room was cluttered and dim, with shelves full of rock samples, dusty ledgers, and strange glass instruments. Behind a high counter, a very old man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles as thick as bottle bottoms was peering at a small rock through a magnifying glass. He did not look up. "Be with you in a moment," he grunted. I waited, my hand smoothing the fabric of my dress. He finally set the rock down with a sigh and looked at me. His eyes were pale blue and magnified by the lenses. "What can I do for you?" he asked. "I have a sample I need assayed," I said. I carefully took the jar from my bag and placed it on the counter. He picked it up, weighing it in his palm. He squinted at the contents. "Magnetite concentrate," he said, his voice flat. "Where from?" "The Blackwood Mire," I said. "Just west of my town." He looked up at me, and for the first time, his expression showed a flicker of interest, though it was mostly disbelief. "The Blackwood Mire," he repeated. "Daughter, I've been assaying samples from this territory for 40 years. There's nothing in that swamp but peat and mosquitoes. Any fool knows that." "Nevertheless," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "That's where it's from. My husband, he believed there was fine gold there." Mr. Finch grunted again, a sound of profound skepticism. "But he was a businessman." He uncorked the jar and poured a small amount of the black sand onto a piece of paper. He carried it over to his scale, a delicate brass instrument under a glass dome. He shook his head as he worked. "Placer deposits in a swamp bed. Highly irregular. The geology's all wrong." He seemed to be talking more to himself than to me. He finished his measurements, made a note in his ledger, and then looked back at me. "It will take an hour. The fee is $2, payable now." I paid him, and he disappeared into a back room, leaving me alone with the dust and the chemical smell. The wait was the hardest part. The hour stretched into an eternity. I sat on a hard wooden stool, my hands folded in my lap, and tried not to think. I listened to the sounds from the back room, the clink of glass, the roar of a furnace, and then, silence. Mr. Hemlock's condescending smile floated in my mind. Mr. Gable's pitying gaze. The weight of their disbelief felt almost as heavy as the jar in my bag had. I had staked everything on a dead man's theory and a handful of yellow dust. The bell on the door jingled, and a rancher came in, leaving a bag of quartz samples. Mr. Finch came out to speak with him, ignoring me completely. My heart sank. He had forgotten me. The sample was worthless. The rancher left, and Mr. Finch was about to return to the back room when he seemed to remember I was there. He stopped and looked at me, his expression unreadable. He walked slowly to the counter, wiping his hands on a stained rag. He was not looking at me, but at the counter, as if gathering his thoughts. When he finally lifted his eyes, the skepticism was gone. In its place was something else, respect. "Your husband," he began, his voice quiet. "What was his name?" "Thomas Thorne," I said. "He was not a fool," Mr. Finch stated. "It was a verdict." He reached into his vest pocket and placed a small, heavy object on the counter. It was a bead of metal, about the size of a pea. It was not shiny or bright, but had a soft, dull luster. It glowed in the dim light of the office. "Pure gold." "From your jar," he said. He pushed his ledger toward me, his finger pointing to a line of figures. He had documented the weight of the concentrate, the weight of the refined gold, and the current market price per ounce. He did the final calculation. The value of the gold in that one jar, after my fee, is $94. $94. The number hung in the air, unreal. I had paid $12 for the land. This one small jar, the result of weeks of back-breaking labor, was worth almost 8 times what I had paid for the entire swamp. I stared at the small golden bead. It seemed impossible that something so small could hold so much value. How? I whispered. Mr. Finch leaned against the counter. He seemed eager to talk now, the professional curiosity overriding his earlier dismissal. It's placer gold, all right. Some of the finest I've ever seen. Ancient riverbed deposit. The particles are so small, most prospectors would wash them right out of their pans and never even see them. They'd be looking for nuggets, for pickers. But your husband, he understood. He knew he had to collect the concentrate. The sheer volume of it is what makes it valuable. There's not much gold in any single shovelful, but the whole swamp must be saturated with it. He looked at me again, with a new intensity. He wasn't just a prospector, was he? He was a geologist. He read books, I said simply. He did more than read, Mr. Finch corrected. He understood. He tapped the ledger. This is a significant find, Mrs. Thorne. Very significant. He looked at me expectantly. How much more of this concentrate do you have? I thought of the swamp. The endless, dark mud stretching out under the cypress trees. I looked at the small golden bead, then back at Mr. Finch. I have the source, I said. I rode the train back home in a daze. The $94, minus my train fare, was folded carefully in my purse. It felt like an impossible weight, a dangerous secret. The other passengers, farmers and merchants, talked and laughed, oblivious. I sat by the window and watched the prairie scroll by, but I did not see it. I saw Thomas's face, bent over a book by candlelight. I saw his hands, drawing the diagrams in the journal. All those quiet hours, all that silent study. It had not been an escape from our life, it had been his desperate, brilliant attempt to build us a new one. He hadn't been shutting me out. He had been working for me. For us. The grief I had carried for a year, a dull, constant ache, shifted. It was still there, but now it was intertwined with a profound, overwhelming gratitude. He had died, but he had not left me alone. The next morning, I did not go to the swamp. I went to the general store. The owner, Mr. Davies, gave me a polite nod. I was usually a cautious customer, buying only what was necessary: flour, salt, coffee. Today was different. I bought a new shovel, one with a sharp steel blade and a strong hickory handle. I bought 2 sturdy galvanized steel buckets. I bought 100 feet of good rope and a block and tackle. I bought a new pair of leatherwork gloves and a wide-brimmed hat to keep the sun off my face. I paid for it all in cash. Mr. Davies counted the money with raised eyebrows but said nothing. The purchases felt momentous. They were not items of survival, they were tools of enterprise. They were an investment. When I returned to the swamp, it looked the same. The same stagnant water, the same grasping cypress knees, the same drone of insects. But I saw it differently. It was no longer a place of decay and loss. It was a place of hidden potential. It was not a wasteland, it was a vault, and Thomas had left me the key. My work changed. It was no longer fueled by a desperate, fragile hope. It was driven by a quiet, steady certainty. The knowledge of what lay hidden in the mud transformed the labor from a gamble into a harvest. The work was still hard. My muscles still ached at the end of each day. But my movements were efficient, sure. I built a small dam on the creek to create a deeper pool of water, so I no longer had to haul buckets. I used the rope and tackle to lift larger loads of the heavy clay. I refined my rocking technique, learning the exact motion that settled the most gold. I was no longer just following Thomas's instructions, I was mastering his craft. I worked through the heat of the summer and into the cool days of autumn. The pile of concentrate grew. I filled the other 5 glass jars from the box, and when those were full, I bought a dozen more from Mr. Davies. Mr. Gable would sometimes see me from the road, a small, solitary figure working a strange machine in the middle of the swamp. He no longer stopped to ask what I was doing. He would just shake his head and ride on. The town's laughter, which had once echoed so loudly in my ears, had faded completely. It was replaced by a silent, confused curiosity. I did not care. Their opinions were irrelevant. I had my work. I had Thomas's legacy. And every evening, I had the quiet satisfaction of watching the day's tiny, hard-won specks of gold settle at the bottom of a jar. A year passed. Then another. The rhythm of my life was dictated by the seasons. In the spring and autumn, I worked the swamp from dawn until dusk. In the heat of summer, I worked in the cooler hours of the morning and evening. In the winter, when the creek froze and the ground was hard, I rested. I made the trip to Prairie Ridge to see Mr. Finch 4 times a year. Each visit was the same. I would arrive with a heavy bag of jars filled with black sand. He would greet me not with skepticism, but with the quiet respect of a colleague. We would talk about geology, about the different layers of clay I was uncovering, about the subtle variations in the fineness of the gold. He would do his work, and I would leave with a thick fold of cash. The money changed my life, but not in the ways people might have expected. I did not build a grand house. I did not move away. I continued to live in my small, simple cabin. But the cabin was no longer small because of poverty, it was small because of choice. I paid off the last of Thomas's debts. I had the roof repaired. I bought a new stove that held its heat through the night. I bought books, the kinds Thomas used to read, on geology and engineering. I read them in the evenings, by the light of a new, bright lamp, and I began to understand the science behind my own labor. The greatest change was the absence of fear. The quiet, gnawing anxiety about the coming winter, about the price of flour, about a dress wearing out, it was gone. In its place was a deep, unshakable security. One evening in late fall, I stood at the edge of the swamp as the sun went down. The sky was a brilliant, painful orange, and the cypress trees were black silhouettes. The air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. My hands rested on the worn handle of my shovel. They were stained, scarred, and calloused, the nails permanently rimmed with black mud. They were not the hands of the woman who had stood nervously in the land office 3 years earlier. They were the hands of a miner. A businesswoman. A geologist. They were the hands of a wealthy woman. I looked out over the dark water. The world saw a swamp. A useless, ugly piece of land that a foolish widow had bought for $12. They saw mud and mosquitoes and decay. They did not see the ancient river that slept beneath. They did not see the patient accumulation of geologic time. They did not see the fine, invisible dust of gold that infused every handful of clay. Thomas had seen it. His great gift to me was not the gold itself. The gold was just metal, a means to an end. His real gift was the journal. It was the knowledge. He had taught me, even after he was gone, how to look at a worthless thing and see its hidden value. He taught me that the most profound treasures are not found, but extracted. They require work, patience, and a belief in what others cannot see. The men in that office, they saw only the surface of things. And I suppose, in the end, that is the only real difference between wealth and poverty. It is not about what you have. It is about what you are willing to see.